Republicans say Muslims don't belong here after an attempted terror attack against New York's Mayor Zohran Mamdani, and the House Speaker Mike Johnson says nothing really to condemn those comments. Another special guest is going to be with us at the table.
Are we really going to pretend that you're the answer to CNN's need for fair and balanced coverage and new audience? Because you're failing. No one watches you. Your audience has been cut to below 400,000, which is a complete embarrassment. You ought to be fired, and your cocky, smug sense of self ought to be wiped away in one ratings period because no one watches you. What does it say that you're the most interesting thing on CNN and literally nobody's watching you? Okay. You don't have a long job trajectory, sweetheart. And when you eventually get fired as your network implodes and try to go out into the independent lane, you will fail there too, because all you do is speak in a monotone and say things that attack President Trump while trying to sound reasonable, but not being reasonable, and constantly cutting off the one conservative on your panel and showing slight indignation whenever they make a good point for who could listen to this woman? It's horrible. She's got more people on her panel than she does audience members.
All right, so we got to talk about CNN because what just happened on that network is actually insane, and honestly, it perfectly explains why their ratings just keep collapsing. Because every single time you think CNN has hit rock bottom, somehow they find a way to go even lower. And a big reason for that is something we've been seeing for years now: the absolute nonstop Trump derangement that has been taken over by that network. And CNN used to at least pretend to be a news organization, but now it feels like the entire mission is just oppose Trump at all costs, and even if it makes them look ridiculous, and viewers have noticed. And that's why the ratings are tanking. When you look at the numbers, CNN's primetime shows are constantly finishing last. In many cases, their shows are getting beaten by Fox News programs that air later in the night. And if you think about how embarrassing that is, your primetime lineup is getting outperformed by shows that come on after primetime somewhere else. And that tells you everything you need to know about where the network is right now. But it gets worse than just bad ratings, because now you're starting to see the consequences of what happens when a network becomes completely consumed by political narratives instead of facts. And one of the clearest examples of that right now is Abby Phillip. Abby Phillip is supposed to be a journalist. She's supposed to be hosting discussions and presenting facts. But instead, what you're getting is propaganda. And now she's facing calls to be fired after pushing a claim on air about a terrorist attack in New York City that turned out to be completely false. And what actually happened was radical Islamic extremists throwing bombs outside of Zohran Mamdani mansion while protesters were gathered there. But when Abby Phillip went on air, she told the already tiny audience that CNN still has left. CNN still has left that Mamdani himself was the target of the attack. In other words, she flipped the entire story upside down, and it didn't stop there, because during the same segment, Anna Navarro repeated the same claim, right, of telling, of basically telling the audience, the tiny audience on CNN, that Mamdani himself was the target of attack. So Abby Phillip didn't correct it at all. No pushback, no clarification, nothing, which tells you a lot about whether this was actually a mistake or something else. Now I want you guys to check out this next clip in regards of the matter. When it comes to that whole segment, check it out.
Up next, 2 Republicans say Muslims don't belong here after an attempted terror attack against New York's Mayor Zohran Mamdani, and the House Speaker Mike Johnson says nothing really to condemn those comments. Another special guest is going to be with us at the table when we come back. Speaker Mike Johnson has a rhetoric problem on his hands after 2 of his members made anti-Muslim comments. This week, Congressman Andy Ogles wrote on social media that Muslims don't belong in American society, that pluralism is a lie, and in a post today, he called Muslims barbarians. Congressman Randy Fine is also facing backlash over his post calling for Muslims to be deported and pushing to denaturalize American citizens. And tonight, Johnson acknowledged speaking with both men, but stopped short of condemning their language.
There's a lot of energy in the country and a lot of popular sentiment that the demand to impose Sharia law in America is a serious problem. That's what animates this, and that's the you know, the language that people use, it's different language than I would use, but I think that that's a serious issue.
Founder and executive director of the National Security Institute, Jamil Jaffer, joins us in our fifth seat. And Jamil, do you think that this is really all about the fear that there's really going to be Sharia law installed here in the United States?
Well, that's not what Randy Fine or Andy Ogle said. What Andy Ogle said was Muslims don't belong in America, that they have no place here, that they should all go home. Even the ones born here, apparently, should go God knows where, but somewhere, apparently. And Randy Fine said, if it's a choice between dogs and Muslims, I'll take dogs. Now, I have 3 dogs. I love my dogs, right? But we're a Muslim household, and we're fine with dogs. It's all good.
I have to choose between dogs or Randy Fine.
I will say my wife might choose the dogs over me. So, you know, there are some Muslims who might lose out to dogs.
And Speaker Johnson coddling this bigotry, I think, is the other part of the story, to be honest.
A few things. First of all, my grandpa moved from Syria in the early 80s, and my dad's whole side of the family, they are Muslim. So anti-Muslim bigotry has been around for decades and decades. I will say, my grandpa who moved here, the Muslim community he lives in Indiana, is full of doctors, heart surgeons, people who have helped their community. I also find it very ironic that Republicans are so welcoming to any form of bigotry. They're so welcoming to anti-trans bigotry. They're so welcoming to anti-Muslim bigotry. You're making a face, but these are bigoted comments they made. But the moment that bigotry is targeted towards them, they freak the hell out. You have to stop any bigotry before it enters your movement. I just find it funny when Randy Fine will be super Islamophobic, but then he'll be on the floor whenever something is directed at Jewish people, which, by the way, you should never be bigoted towards anybody. Stop the bigotry before it enters your movement. But how do you only micro-focus on for certain forms of bigotry? I just don't.
What I find ironic is, so supposedly some of these comments are as a result of the attempt against Mayor Mamdani in New York, who was raised Muslim, was he not? Himself. Yeah. So they're being anti-Muslim and they're finally defending Mamdani over something.
To be clear, the attack wasn't on Mayor Mamdani. It was on people protesting. It was attacking protesters, people protesting Mamdani.
Right by his house.
To frame it as an anti-Muslim attack would actually completely reverse what happened. Someone who shouted Allah Akbar through a bomb that didn't go off at the protesters.
Republicans are finally doing something in defense of a Muslim, in this case, Mamdani.
As a Republican,
but let me just finish this point.
Anti-Muslim.
I can't speak for Mike Johnson, but I would say we've had 2 terrorist attacks here in the last 10 days.
What does that have to do with Muslims?
So can we condemn those? Why are we?
Of course. What does that have to do with Muslims?
What does that have to do with Muslims?
There is a radical strain of Islam that's led to these terrorist attacks. Obviously, the vast majority of Muslims are
people
peaceful.
with terroristic ideologies here and all around the world. What does that have to do with whether Muslims belong in American society as a group?
Yeah, and let's be clear.
I'd like to hear the answer.
I'm talking about what Mike Johnson was saying.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what he didn't say.
But you haven't read his full quote.
What I'm talking about is what he didn't say.
Islamic extremism without compromising our commitment to religious liberty. He was chiding those 2 members of Congress. And by the way, as a Republican,
was he?
As a Republican, I believe that the same. I believe that the same amendment.
There are strong language.
The same amendment that gives those 2 members of Congress.
Or is it bigotry, Joe?
The same amendment that gives those 2 members of Congress the right to say things that are offensive, that I find actually offensive as well, is the same amendment that permits Muslim people to be here proudly and practice their faith.
Nobody said that Mike Johnson should throw them in jail. I think the question was, is he going to clearly say that they crossed a line? And he characterized it as he basically characterized it as strong language.
I think
it's not strong language.
I think he said the language they use is very wrong.
Okay, what you just said, he didn't say.
I read what he said.
Wow. What a segment. So seriously, I got a whole lot to say about that. But before we get deeper into the story itself, let's talk about the reaction, because the backlash, man, was immediate. A lot of people are now calling for CNN to fire Abby Phillip outright. They're basically saying enough is enough at this point. The argument people are making is simple. This woman is not functioning as a journalist anymore. She's functioning as an activist, and she's functioning as a propagandist for Democrats. And people are saying what she's doing is actually below the standards of CNN. Now, let's be real here. CNN standards are already pretty low these days, but even with that low bar, people are looking at Abby Phillip's show and saying this is too much. And her show has basically turned into a disaster. The ratings aren't good. The credibility isn't good. The format, in theory, is actually not a bad concept. A panel discussion with different viewpoints could be interesting if it were moderated fairly. But that's the problem. You don't have a neutral moderator. Instead, you have someone who constantly interrupts conservatives while letting liberal panelists say whatever they want without challenge. And viewers have picked up on that pattern. And that's why people are comparing Abby Phillip to Joy Reid 2.0, maybe even worse. Critics like Carmen Sabia, who you see here, Carmine Sabia, he says, it was not an error. You are a propagandist. I watch you slick every night. Right? So he pointed out that night after she pretends to be a journalist while only correcting conservatives, letting liberals go unchecked, and now apparently pushing narratives that turned out to not be true. Now, if you want to give her the benefit of the doubt, you could say maybe she just made a mistake. Maybe she got the story mixed up. That's the charitable explanation. But the problem with the explanation is pretty obvious. First of all, she's usually reading from a teleprompter, which means the wording wasn't written ahead of time. Either she wrote it or someone on her team wrote it. And second, Anna Navarro repeated the exact same false claim during the panel discussion that Mudami was the target of the attack and that this was some kind of anti-Muslim incident. Abby Phillip had every opportunity to correct that claim, and she didn't do it. Instead, the conservative on the panel, Carmine, who you see here, basically had to push back and explain the facts. Meanwhile, the host, whose job it is to maintain accuracy, said nothing. And that's why a lot of people don't believe this was an accident. And eventually the backlash got so big, Abby Phillip issued a correction herself the next morning, as you guys can see on the screen here. And she says, I want to correct something I said last night. The bombs thrown in New York City over the weekend by ISIS-inspired attackers were thrown into a crowd of anti-Muslim protesters and not specifically targeted at Mayor Mudami. That wording was inaccurate, and I didn't catch it ahead of time. I apologize for the error. So she says she wanted to correct something she said the night before, right? Acknowledging that the bombs thrown in New York City by ISIS-inspired attackers were thrown in a crowd of protesters and not specifically Mudami. And she said the wording she used was inaccurate and she apologized for that, right? We just read it. But let's be honest here. The explanation didn't convince a lot of people because she had multiple chances to correct the record in real time. And she could have corrected herself during the segment, and she could have corrected Anna Navarro when Navarro repeated the claim. She didn't do either of those things. And the correction only came after the backlash started going viral online. And that's why people believe this wasn't a mistake. They believe it was intentional framing that blew up in her face, because when the clip started spreading across the social media, suddenly the narrative collapsed and now the network had to scramble and scrape to clean it up. And when you look at that, This Story Matters isn't just about one incorrect statement. It's about why the story was framed that way in the first place, because the real story here is actually serious. We're talking about violent attacks connected to radical Islamic extremism. And that's the real issue that people should be discussing. But instead of focusing on that, the conversation immediately shifted towards accusations of hate, bigotry coming from Republicans. And that's the pattern. Instead of examining the ideology behind the attack, the conversation gets redirected toward protecting the narrative. And you saw that happen during the panel discussion. When one panelist pointed out that the attack was connected to radical Islamic extremism, Abby Phillip responded by asking, what did it have to do with Muslims? But that question doesn't really make sense in this context, because these attacks are ideologically motivated, and radical Islamic extremism is an ideology that drives certain individuals towards violence. And acknowledging that reality isn't bigotry is simply recognizing the motivation behind the act. So you have people, right, down in her comments after she said the next day, she basically said that she was wrong. You have people like Jeffrey Mead. He's phenomenal. He said, I was literally about to make a video calling you out. What you should probably do is say this on air, because a lot of people that watch CNN don't have X. And this is the backlash she faced, right? Then you have Vincent Oshana, fake news, getting called out for reporting fake news. Then she goes back on Fake News Network to say she reported fake news, and today she'll go right back to reporting fake news. In other words, business as usual at CNN. Then we go down, and you have, if you have any ounce of integrity left, you will go on air and correct it. Let's see what happens. Right? So that's the backlash. That's the gist of it. And then you have Jay here. He said, if CNN has any ounce of integrity left, that they would suspend Abby Phillip immediately. She should be fired. A half-assed ex-post doesn't cut it out for what she said. This isn't the first time she has blatantly lied about a situation. Intentionally lying and misleading about a terrorist attack should never be allowed on the most trusted name in news. It's time to find a replacement. And what he's saying here in quotes about the most trusted name in news, that is CNN slogan. That is CNN mantra. That's what they stand for, as basically saying that they're the most trusted news. But what Abby Phillip did, this is exactly why CNN keeps running into credibility problems. Because when audiences feel like information is being filtered through a political lens, they stop trusting the source delivering that information. And people don't want to feel like they're being manipulated. They don't want to feel like the facts are being reshaped to protect a political narrative. But that's the perception viewers are getting when they watch segments like this. And it feels like the priority isn't explaining what happened. The priority is making sure the conversation stays within certain ideological boundaries. And once viewers start noticing the pattern, the trust disappears. And that loss of trust is showing up clearly in CNN's ratings. The network has been struggling for years. Their primetime lineup consistently trails behind competitors, in many cases Fox News, airing later in the evening, pulling in significantly larger audiences than CNN's main programs. And that's not just a small problem. That's a sign that the network has lost a huge portion of its audience. And shows like Abby Phillips are supposed to help rebuild that audience by offering debate and discussion. But if viewers feel like the moderator is biased, the entire format collapses. Right. And that's why this situation could be a real problem for CNN internally. And at the end of the day, television networks make decisions based on ratings. If a show isn't performing and it's generating controversy that damages the network's credibility, executives eventually start asking questions, not necessarily because they suddenly care about journalistic integrity, but because they care about viewership numbers. And right now, Abby Phillips' show is not exactly dominating in that department. So a lot of critics are saying Abby Phillips' future at CNN might be limited, not because this is the first time something like this has happened, but because it fits into a larger pattern that viewers have already noticed. And conservatives don't watch because they see the show as a hostile to their views, and liberals often prefer other programs that reinforce their perspective more clearly. So the audience end up shrinking from both sides, and that really sums up the bigger problem CNN is facing. And the network keeps pushing narratives that viewers simply don't buy anymore. And every time a story gets framed in a way that feels misleading or politically motivated, it erodes trust even further. And that's why the ratings keep dropping. And that's why clips like this go viral, not because people are watching CNN live, but because people share the clips when the network says something outrageous. So yeah, I think Abby Phillip might be in serious trouble at CNN, not necessarily because she lied. Let's be honest, CNN clearly doesn't care about that, but because the ratings for her show are terrible. And if the numbers were great, she'll probably be completely safe. But however, I want you guys to see the facts as you see in regards of what was the truth that Abby Phillip lied about. And we're about to check that out right now.
And CNN facing backlash over a now deleted post about the two New York City terror suspects who threw those IEDs outside a Gracie mansion. Here's the original post. CNN writing, quote, two Pennsylvania teenagers crossed into New York City Saturday morning for what could have been a normal day enjoying the city during abnormally warm weather. Yeah, that's their first line. But in less than an hour, their lives would drastically change as the pair would be arrested for throwing homemade bombs during an anti-Muslim protest outside of Mayor Zohran Mamdani's home. But after facing fierce criticism, CNN put out a statement saying the post, quote, failed to reflect the gravity of the incident, thereby breaching the editorial standards we require for all our reporting. Here to react, Fox News contributor and Washington Examiner senior writer Joe Concha. Joe, how does someone who has managed to get a job at the national news level, you know, understanding what the lead of a story is and what's the supplemental information in a story, ever think to write that story like it's a feature in the travel section?
Great question and great framing there, Todd. Not only did they bury the lead, they put it like 10 feet under, picked it up and buried it again. I mean, this is not something that you could take seriously in any way, shape, or form. I mean, imagine if CNN covering the Pearl Harbor attacks of 1941, it would sound something like this. You know, two Japanese sailors were in the Pacific in search of mermaids. like in that Tom Hanks movie Splash, when suddenly they stumbled upon this thing called Hawaii and the U.S. military port called Pearl Harbor, when suddenly they were unwittingly engaged in these attacks on U.S. naval operations. It's really no different in terms of what we're seeing here, what happened in New York over the weekend. If these IEDs went off, Todd, it would be like the Boston bombing all over again, more than a decade ago. And we remember what happened there. A 10-year-old boy was blown up, 3 people were killed, 500 injured. Look, these suspects are Islamic extremists who sought to take out and maim Americans that they disagreed with. And the mayor, Zoran Mamdani, like we just heard from our last guest, in his statements afterwards, prioritized the protesters who were protesting against him, or at least, against these people that were really upset that the Ayatollah was blown up. He actually prioritized talking about them over the terrorists who tried to kill them. So this is where we are at this point. But thank God the NYPD did their job and made sure that no one was hurt here, because this could have been very, very bad, Todd.
Yeah, and thank goodness these things were failures and didn't go off. But you mentioned the media, obviously. What will it take for the media to acknowledge that Islamic extremism is a scourge on society? Because in all of these articles, they seem to gloss over that key part, Joe.
I think that in CNN's case, for example, we just want to isolate this to CNN. You have to change leadership, which will be happening after the sale. Bring in a Bari Weiss or somebody who understands what journalism is. You have to basically, like Indiana football, Todd, because we can relate to this, but just to let everybody know, Indiana University had the worst record of any Division I football program in the country. And then suddenly they brought in new coaching, they brought in new players, and suddenly changed the culture, and they won the national championship last year. You have to change everything if you want to actually get journalism, in this case, from a CNN or other news outlets. Otherwise, this is going to keep happening again and again, and we're going to talk about it on this network again and again, because that's what's going to do it at this point, unfortunately, Todd.
Well, we'll be watching to see if there are any changes at CNN. In the meantime, Joe Concha, thank you. Appreciate your insight on this.
I'm Steve Ducey. I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And
So there you have it, family. And if the numbers were great, Abby Phillip, she'll probably be completely safe. But when the viewership is bad and controversies keep piling up, that's when networks start making changes. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think this was just a mistake, or do you think it was intentional? It was an intentional narrative framing that backfire? Let me know in the comments. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.